The sharp knock echoed through the small wooden cabin, a stark contrast against the howling wind outside. Who could possibly be here at this hour, in the heart of the frozen wilderness? Who could have survived the brutal snowstorm raging outside? More importantly, what would they want from her? Inside the cabin, Seria jolted awake, heart pounding. Her eyes immediately locked onto the door. She sat up, listening carefully, every muscle tense, prepared for any potential threat. This cabin had always been her safe haven. Hidden deep within a landscape, no living creature dared enter. Another knock came. Weaker this time, more desperate. Seria rose swiftly, silently, grabbing her sharp blade from beside her bed. The cold steel felt reassuring in her grip as she cautiously moved toward the door, every sense alert. Her thoughts raced with possibilities: a lost traveler, a desperate refugee, or perhaps something more dangerous, someone sent by those she'd spent years hiding from. "Please," came a raspy, weak voice from beyond the heavy door. "Help me." She hesitated, gripping the handle of her knife tightly, heart pounding rapidly against her ribcage. Why should she help? It was against everything she'd taught herself. She had isolated herself intentionally, building this cabin far away from prying eyes. But something in the stranger's voice tugged at a forgotten sense of compassion, buried beneath layers of distrust and survival instinct. Exhaling sharply, she slid the knife back into its sheath and unlocked the heavy wooden door. She swung it open with determination, bracing herself against the biting gusts of icy wind that swept in, tugging at her dark hair and stinging her face. In the doorway stood a man, human, tall and broad-shouldered, trembling violently. His flight suit was shredded and covered in frost, clearly damaged in a recent crash. His short dark hair was stiff with ice, his pale face and blue-tinged lips a clear indication of severe hypothermia. "You must help me," he pleaded weakly, his bright blue eyes sharp despite exhaustion. He swayed unsteadily, barely managing to stay upright. Seria stood motionless, taking a quick but thorough assessment. A human, here? It had been many years since she'd last encountered one face-to-face. The tension between her people and humans was ancient and bitter, marked by generations of hatred and conflict. Helping him went against every instinct ingrained into her by her people. Yet she found herself stepping aside, voice commanding and firm. "Get inside." Without hesitation, the man staggered forward and collapsed onto the rough wooden floor. Seria quickly shut the door, blocking out the relentless storm and icy winds. She leaned back against it for a brief moment, collecting her thoughts, watching carefully as he shivered violently. "Take off your wetsuit before you freeze to death," she ordered sharply, moving away to keep a safe distance. He glanced up, his lips forming a faint smile despite his pain. "Are you always this welcoming, or is it just my lucky day?" She narrowed her eyes slightly, unimpressed. "Would you prefer I toss you back into the storm?" He managed a weak chuckle as he slowly peeled off the damaged flight suit. Seria turned away briefly, granting him a semblance of privacy. She fetched a heavy, fur-lined blanket and tossed it toward him, keeping her distance deliberately. "Sit by the fire," she instructed sharply. "You'll warm up quicker." He obeyed, wrapping the blanket around himself and shifting closer to the crackling flames. Color began returning to his pale skin, and his shivers gradually subsided. "Thank you," he said softly, looking around her cabin curiously. "I'm Carl." Seria hesitated. Sharing her name felt oddly significant, dangerous even. But something in his open expression eased her caution just enough. "Seria," she said curtly, her tone neutral. Carl smiled faintly, genuinely relieved. "Nice to meet you, Seria." She didn't respond immediately, her focus instead on preparing a metal cup of steaming water from the pot over the fire. When she handed it to him, their fingers brushed briefly. Seria jerked her hand back, startled by the unexpected warmth and the small spark that traveled up her spine. Why was she feeling this strange unease? He was human, vulnerable, and posed little threat to her in his current state. Still, her instinct warned her to stay alert, to remain guarded. "What happened to your ship?" she asked, breaking the awkward silence. Carl sighed deeply, his expression darkening. "It was destroyed when I crashed. There's nothing left." "And your people?" Seria asked, maintaining a cautious distance. He shook his head slowly, eyes shadowed with bitterness. "They won't search for me. They don't waste resources on someone they deem a lost cause." Seria studied him intently, sensing a sincerity behind his pain. She knew well the bitter sting of abandonment, the deep wound left by betrayal. But could their shared experiences be enough reason to trust him? You seem to know a lot about survival, Carl observed quietly, carefully warming his hands by the fire. How long have you been out here alone? She regarded him silently, debating how much to reveal. Finally, she responded cautiously, long enough to prefer solitude. He nodded thoughtfully, seeming to understand more than his casual demeanor let on. Why did you help me, Seria? The direct question caught her off guard. Why indeed? She had no clear answer to that herself. Her response came out sharper than intended. Don't mistake necessity for kindness. You die here. You become my problem. Carl's lips curved into a small smile. Noted. A tense silence settled over them, punctuated only by the crackle of the fireplace. Seria moved restlessly around the cabin, pretending to busy herself to avoid the unsettling intimacy of Carl's presence. You've been here alone all this time? Carl asked gently, clearly attempting to fill the awkward silence. Yes, she answered, her voice quiet. And that's how I intended it to stay. Carl's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, clearly sensing something deeper behind her curt replies. Looks like fate had other plans, he murmured with a faint smile. Fate, she echoed skeptically. Or just bad luck. He laughed softly, eyes twinkling despite his exhaustion. Maybe both. She paused, glancing back at him briefly. She was unsure why, but despite all her reservations, Carl's easy humor was slowly chipping away at her icy exterior. She shook herself mentally. It was dangerous to let her guard down, especially with a stranger, and yet part of her found a strange comfort in his company, something she'd thought lost long ago. Outside, the storm howled on, relentless and merciless. But inside the small cabin, something fragile and uncertain had taken root. Seria knew one thing clearly. Her life, so carefully isolated and hidden away, was about to change irrevocably. But many questions remained unanswered. Who was Carl, truly? What had really caused his crash? And why, of all places in this frozen wasteland, had he arrived at her doorstep? Above all else, could she trust him? Could she afford to? To discover the answers, she'd need to confront her past, something she had spent years avoiding. The only certainty was this: nothing would ever be the same again. To uncover the truth, you'd have to listen to the story until its very end. Seria moved quietly around the cabin, gathering some dried herbs from the shelves near the fireplace. She felt Carl's eyes on her, a steady, curious gaze that made her skin prickle slightly with unease. It had been years since she'd felt anyone else's presence here, let alone a human's. Every instinct she had screamed at her to stay cautious. You built all this yourself? Carl asked, breaking the silence. Seria glanced over her shoulder, her expression guarded. Yes, I needed a safe place, away from everyone and everything. Impressive, Carl murmured genuinely, taking another sip of the steaming water she'd provided. Not many people could survive out here alone. I'm not most people, she said bluntly, turning her back to him again as she continued preparing some tea. The aroma filled the small cabin, bringing with it memories she had long tried to bury. Clearly, Carl said with quiet admiration. How long has it been since you've seen another person? Seria hesitated. Revealing too much felt risky, yet there was an earnestness in his voice that made lying difficult. Years. Many years. Carl's eyebrows lifted in surprise. That's a long time to choose solitude. She didn't respond immediately, focusing instead on pouring the tea into 2 small cups. Finally, she turned and offered one to Carl, keeping her distance as she handed it over. Sometimes solitude chooses you, she said quietly, her voice tinged with bitterness. Carl studied her face thoughtfully, clearly sensing the hidden layers beneath her guarded exterior. Sounds like you speak from experience. Seria's eyes narrowed slightly, defensive walls rising again. We all have our reasons. He nodded, seeming to accept her vague response. Fair enough. A tense silence settled once more, broken only by the occasional pop from the fireplace. Seria found herself observing Carl discreetly. Despite the bruises and exhaustion etched on his features, there was something calm and reassuring about his presence, something she had not felt in a very long time. Carl finally broke the silence again, carefully setting his cup down. You didn't ask why my people won't come looking for me. She shrugged slightly, feigning indifference. Does it matter? It does to me, Carl said softly, sincerity in his voice catching her off guard. They abandoned me because I chose to do what was right rather than follow orders blindly. Seria felt a sudden jolt of recognition, a connection that startled her deeply. She met his gaze, seeing reflected in his eyes the same pain she'd carried for so long. "You disobeyed an order," she said quietly, a statement rather than a question. Carl nodded solemnly, looking directly into her eyes. "I refused to hurt innocent people. For that they marked me as expendable." Seria's heart twisted painfully in her chest. It was a familiar story, far too familiar. Her guarded expression softened slightly, sympathy creeping in despite herself. "Doing the right thing often comes with a heavy price," she murmured quietly, more to herself than to Carl. He smiled gently, understanding fully what she meant. "Yes, but sometimes that price is worth paying." Seria held his gaze for a long moment, feeling a reluctant respect begin to form between them. Maybe, just maybe, she had made the right choice letting him in. Carl settled back against the wall, wrapping the blanket tighter around his shoulders. The warmth of the tea began to chase away the lingering cold from his bones. He studied Seria quietly, noting the careful movements and constant vigilance with which she carried herself. It was obvious she'd lived under constant threat for a long time. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he asked, trying to ease the tension. She shot him a wary look but said nothing, stirring the fire absently instead. Carl continued softly, sensing that pushing too hard would drive her further away. "Back where I come from, people with skills like yours usually have military backgrounds." She paused momentarily, the poker frozen in her hand. "I used to be," she admitted reluctantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Carl leaned forward slightly, curiosity piqued. "What made you leave?" Seria stared into the flames, her eyes reflecting both anger and sadness. After a long silence, she spoke slowly, as if each word was painful to utter. "They ordered me to do something unforgivable. I refused." "Like me," Carl murmured softly, understanding blossoming between them. She looked at him sharply, eyes probing, measuring him again as if reassessing whether he was worthy of trust. Eventually, her expression softened, just slightly. "Yes, like you." A newfound respect passed silently between them. The weight of their shared experiences was heavy, binding them in a subtle yet powerful way. Carl let the silence linger, aware that it said far more than words ever could. Seria finally sat down across from him, holding her own cup tightly, her posture still guarded but less hostile than before. "Why did they want you dead, Carl?" she asked quietly, genuine curiosity softening her voice. He hesitated briefly before answering, weighing how much truth to share, but something told him honesty was crucial here. "I was a pilot in the Earth Defense Force," he explained slowly, watching her reaction carefully. "My squad was ordered to bomb a settlement. Civilians, mostly women and children. They called it necessary to end a rebellion quickly. I couldn't do it, so they labeled me a traitor." Seria's eyes flashed with a mix of recognition and pain. "It's always the innocent who pay the price." Carl nodded solemnly, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. "I couldn't live with myself if I'd followed those orders." Seria studied him closely, the flickering flames casting shadows across her sharp features. "Doing what's right often means losing everything. But sometimes it leads you exactly where you're meant to be." Carl responded quietly, meeting her gaze steadily. She looked away, clearly unsettled by the implication, but he could see the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Outside, the storm continued to rage relentlessly, battering against the small cabin. Yet inside, something had subtly shifted. A fragile bridge of understanding was forming, connecting two souls who had long believed they were alone in their pain. Carl took another sip of tea, letting the comfortable silence wrap around them. Perhaps against all odds, he'd found an ally in the most unexpected place. Seria watched Carl quietly from across the fire, the cautious silence between them now less oppressive. She couldn't deny the strange sense of relief she felt, knowing someone else understood the weight she carried. Yet, opening herself even slightly, felt like a risk she wasn't sure she was ready to take. "How long do you think the storm will last?" Carl asked, breaking her train of thought. Seria glanced toward the thick wooden door, listening carefully to the fierce winds howling outside. "Days perhaps. Storms here aren't quick to pass." Carl nodded, absorbing her words thoughtfully. He glanced around the cabin, taking in every detail with careful consideration. "You have enough supplies?" he asked, genuine concern evident in his voice. Seria smiled faintly, appreciating his thoughtfulness despite herself. I've lived here long enough to know how to prepare. We'll be fine. Carl leaned back, his posture relaxing slightly. He seemed genuinely relieved by her reassurance. Good. I wouldn't want to become a burden. You're not, Seria replied quietly, surprising herself with the honesty in her voice. He smiled warmly, a warmth that seemed to seep past her carefully built defenses. I'm glad to hear that. She studied him closely, noticing the subtle ways he shifted, clearly uncomfortable from his injuries, but trying not to show it. Her gaze softened. Perhaps there was more humanity left in her than she'd realized. Are you hurt? She asked gently, her voice barely audible over the fire's soft crackle. Carl hesitated, clearly reluctant to admit weakness, but eventually nodded slowly. My side hurts. I think I bruised a rib in the crash. Seria rose immediately, retrieving a small medical kit from a shelf near the fireplace. Carl watched her curiously, as she knelt beside him, carefully opening the kit. Let me see, she said quietly, her tone firm yet reassuring. He lifted his shirt slowly, revealing bruised and scraped skin. Seria examined him with gentle fingers, her touch surprisingly tender, despite her usual harsh demeanor. Carl winced slightly, but held still, watching her with a mix of surprise and gratitude. You're lucky, she murmured, carefully applying a soothing ointment to the bruise. It could have been worse. I already feel lucky, Carl replied softly, his eyes locked onto her face. Seria paused briefly, catching his gaze. She felt a small flush rise to her cheeks, quickly looking away to regain her composure. You should rest. The ointment will help with the pain. Carl nodded slowly, leaning back against the wall again. Thank you, Seria, for everything. She met his eyes again, sincerity clear in her voice. You're welcome. The room fell silent again, a more comfortable silence now, broken only by the fire and the relentless winds outside. Seria moved back to her spot across from Carl, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone. Maybe, just maybe, trusting Carl wouldn't turn out to be a mistake after all. The storm continued to rage outside, battering the cabin with relentless fury. Hours had passed, yet the blizzard showed no signs of slowing down. Inside, the atmosphere had settled into a quiet rhythm, punctuated only by the occasional crackling of the fire. Carl shifted slightly, trying to find a comfortable position against the wall. He caught Seria watching him again, her expression thoughtful but guarded. You're still awake, he noted softly, offering a small smile. I don't sleep much, she admitted quietly, her gaze drifting back to the flames. Old habits. Carl nodded, understanding. It's hard to let your guard down when you've had to survive for so long. Seria looked up, her eyes meeting his. He considered her words for a moment before speaking again, curiosity driving him gently forward. Have you ever thought about leaving this place? Seria hesitated, clearly conflicted by the question. Finally, she sighed softly, shoulders slumping slightly in rare vulnerability. Sometimes, but there's nowhere safe left for me. This wilderness is my refuge. You deserve better than constant isolation, Carl said sincerely, his voice gentle yet firm. You deserve a chance at a real life. She studied him carefully, eyes narrowing slightly. Why do you care? Carl paused, thoughtful. Because I know what it feels like to be alone, truly alone. No one deserves that. A tense silence followed, Seria visibly struggling with her emotions. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. Trusting people has only ever hurt me. Carl leaned forward slightly, compassion clear in his gaze. Then we're the same. But sometimes, taking a risk is the only way to find something worth holding on to. She looked at him intently, visibly moved by his honesty. Her voice was softer when she spoke again. And what is it you're holding on to, Carl? He met her gaze directly, sincerity shining through clearly. Hope. Even after everything, I still believe there's good out there, and maybe good in here too. Seria inhaled sharply, clearly affected by his words. She looked away quickly, trying to regain her composure. The vulnerability made her uncomfortable, yet strangely, it was also comforting to hear someone speak so openly. You're an unusual man, she finally murmured, her tone softer than before. Carl smiled gently, sensing the delicate balance between them, shifting towards something deeper. I'll take that as a compliment, She chuckled quietly, surprising herself again. You probably shouldn't. He laughed softly, easing the tension further. I'll risk it. Another comfortable silence settled around them. Despite the howling storm outside, warmth filled the small cabin, something deeper and far more reassuring than the fire alone. Seria stole another glance at Carl, noticing how easily his presence had broken through her carefully constructed barriers. Perhaps letting him in wasn't the mistake she'd feared. Maybe, she realized with cautious hope, he was exactly the ally she had long needed. For the first time, the idea of facing the future didn't seem quite so daunting. The storm outside gradually lost some of its fury, shifting from fierce, angry gusts to a steady, rhythmic hum of wind and snow. Inside the cabin, Seria felt the subtle change, though she didn't mention it to Carl. A strange reluctance held her back, an unwillingness to disturb the fragile peace they had built. Carl stretched carefully, wincing slightly at the soreness in his ribs. Seria noticed immediately, a small frown appearing on her face. You should rest, she suggested softly. Your injuries won't heal if you keep moving around. Carl sighed but gave her a small, reassuring smile. I'm all right, I've had worse. I don't doubt it, she said quietly, her eyes gentle yet serious. But you don't need to prove anything here. Not to me. He paused, seeming taken aback by her sincerity. After a moment, his expression softened. Old habits die hard, I suppose. Seria nodded slowly, understanding more than he realized. Survival is instinctive. But sometimes survival means knowing when to accept help. Carl studied her carefully, warmth and gratitude evident in his gaze. Is that what we are now? Helping each other survive? Seria hesitated briefly, before meeting his eyes firmly. It's starting to feel that way. Carl's expression brightened, a genuine smile spreading across his face. Then I'd say I crashed in exactly the right place. She couldn't help the small smile that formed in response, though she quickly tried to hide it. Carl noticed immediately, chuckling softly. You know, he began gently, his voice warm with amusement. You're allowed to smile sometimes. Seria shot him a mock glare, but the warmth in her eyes betrayed her. Careful. Don't push your luck. Carl raised his hands in playful surrender, laughter lighting up his face. Noted. The easy banter between them eased the remaining tension from the air, replacing it with a quiet sense of companionship. For the first time in a long while, Seria allowed herself to relax, even if only slightly. The cabin felt warmer, the walls less confining. After a while, Carl's eyes began to droop, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Seria watched him closely, noticing the struggle between his body's need for rest and his stubborn desire to stay awake. Sleep, she urged softly. I'll keep watch. Carl hesitated briefly, before nodding slowly, clearly appreciating the gesture. All right, but only if you promise to wake me if anything happens. I promise, Seria reassured him, sincerity clear in her voice. With that, Carl finally allowed himself to rest, eyes drifting shut, breathing steadying almost immediately. Seria observed him quietly, feeling strangely protective of this stranger who had so quickly become an ally. The realization surprised her, but she didn't resist it. As she settled back against the wall, she let the quiet wash over her, allowing herself at last to feel safe enough to lower her guard just a little. Perhaps, she mused silently, this was exactly what she'd needed all along. When Carl finally woke again, the storm outside had faded to little more than a gentle whisper. Seria had remained vigilant throughout, her eyes occasionally flickering toward him to ensure he still slept peacefully. Now sensing him stir, she looked over, meeting his sleepy gaze. How long was I out? Carl asked quietly, stretching carefully to test his injuries. A few hours, Seria replied, standing to add more wood to the fire. You needed the rest. Carl nodded gratefully. I feel better, still sore but better. She offered him a faint smile, turning back to the fire. Good, you'll need your strength. The storm is finally breaking. Soon we might have a chance to see what's left of your ship. Carl's expression grew serious. Do you think there's any chance of salvaging equipment or sending a distress signal? Maybe, she said cautiously. But we should be prepared for the worst. Crashes out here rarely leave anything useful behind. He absorbed her words thoughtfully, nodding slowly. Either way, it's worth checking. I don't want to put you in more danger than I already have. Seria turned sharply, her eyes narrowing slightly in concern. You haven't put me in danger, Carl. Not yet. He met her gaze evenly. his voice gentle but firm. Maybe not intentionally, but we both know that helping me could have consequences. She hesitated briefly, knowing he was right, but unwilling to admit it openly. We'll deal with whatever comes. Together. Carl smiled softly, appreciation and relief evident on his face. Together. I liked the sound of that. She felt warmth creeping into her cheeks again, and quickly busied herself by checking their supplies. We'll leave as soon as it's safe enough outside. The sooner we find out what's left, the better. Carl watched her carefully, noting the determination in her stance and expression. He rose slowly, ignoring the dull ache in his ribs, and stepped closer to her. Thank you, Seria, he said quietly, for trusting me enough to take this risk. She glanced up, startled by his proximity, her heart beating slightly faster. Don't thank me yet. We still have a long way to go. Carl reached out cautiously, gently placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I know, but no matter what happens, I won't forget what you've done for me. Seria looked into his eyes, feeling the sincerity radiating from him. It stirred something within her, something she'd long believed lost forever. Hope. Slowly, she nodded, allowing herself to lean into his reassuring touch briefly. Then let's see this through, she said softly, determination and newfound courage strengthening her voice. Carl smiled warmly, squeezing her shoulder gently. Together, outside the winds calmed completely, leaving behind a silent snow-covered world. Inside, the cabin was filled with quiet resolve, marking the beginning of something neither of them had anticipated. A partnership forged in trust, survival, and perhaps something more profound. For Seria and Carl, the journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, they both faced it without fear. Seria pushed open the cabin door slowly, stepping cautiously into the snow-covered landscape. The storm had subsided, leaving behind a pristine expanse of white untouched by footprints. Carl stepped out beside her, squinting slightly against the brightness. It looks peaceful now, Carl murmured softly. Hard to believe it was nearly deadly just hours ago. Appearances can be deceiving, Seria replied, scanning the horizon carefully. We need to move quickly and stay alert. Whoever sent you crashing down might still be nearby. Carl nodded in agreement, his own expression hardening into readiness. I'll follow your lead. She moved forward decisively, stepping lightly through the deep snow, her senses heightened. Carl followed closely, matching her cautious stride. The wreckage site was less than a mile away, but each step felt heavy with tension, anticipation mounting between them. As they neared the crash site, a sense of unease settled over Seria, causing her steps to slow slightly. Something felt off, out of place. Do you feel it? She whispered, eyes narrowing, as she scanned the trees ahead. Carl tensed, sensing her caution. Feel what? We're not alone, she murmured, slowly drawing her blade. Before Carl could reply, a sharp sound split the air, a branch snapping sharply somewhere to their left. Seria whirled instantly, blade raised, her stance defensive. Carl positioned himself protectively at her side, eyes darting around for signs of movement. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the tree line, tall and imposing, his armor dark against the white landscape. His face, partially obscured by a hood, revealed eyes cold with calculation and hostility. Seria recognized the insignia immediately, her heart sinking. They found me, she breathed, voice barely audible. Carl glanced at her, alarm evident in his eyes. Who are they? Hunters, she said sharply, voice tight with tension. Highly trained and extremely dangerous. They never give up. The figure stepped closer, clearly confident in his advantage. His gaze shifted briefly to Carl, assessing and dismissing him quickly before returning to Seria. Velar, he called out, voice rough and commanding. You've been running for too long. It's time to come home. Seria straightened defiantly, her eyes blazing fiercely. I'll never go back. The hunter smirked, drawing a wicked-looking weapon from his side. Then you leave me no choice. Carl moved instinctively closer to Seria, his protective stance clear. She's not going anywhere with you. The hunter raised an eyebrow mockingly. A human, you've fallen far indeed, Seria. Carl stepped forward protectively, jaw clenched. If you want her, you'll have to go through me. Seria felt a rush of gratitude mixed with anxiety. The hunter merely laughed, a harsh and chilling sound. "Very well," he said with dark amusement, stepping closer. "I hoped you'd say that." As he lunged forward, Seria's heart pounded in her chest. She gripped her blade tightly, steeling herself for the fight she had always known would come. But this time she wasn't facing it alone. Carl reacted instantly, diving aside as the hunter lunged forward, the wicked blade slicing through the air where he had stood moments before. Seria moved swiftly, intercepting the hunter's next strike with her own blade, sparks flying as steel met steel. The hunter was strong, his movements calculated and precise. Each attack forced Seria to defend fiercely, pushing her limits. She twisted, narrowly avoiding a blow aimed at her ribs, countering swiftly with a slash that grazed the hunter's armor. "Carl, stay back," she shouted, eyes locked on her opponent. "Not happening," Carl growled, searching desperately around for something useful. Spotting a sturdy fallen branch nearby, he grabbed it and swung hard at the hunter's exposed flank. The blow connected solidly, momentarily staggering their enemy. The hunter snarled, turning sharply to face Carl, his eyes blazing with fury. "You'll regret that, human." Before the hunter could retaliate, Seria took advantage of the distraction, launching herself forward and driving her elbow into his side with fierce determination. The man stumbled, losing balance briefly, and Seria pressed her advantage, landing another powerful blow to his ribs. "Carl, stay back," she shouted urgently, her voice firm. But Carl ignored her warning, adrenaline pumping as he swung again. This time the hunter was prepared, easily dodging Carl's attack and retaliating with a swift, brutal kick. Carl was knocked backward into the snow, gasping in pain. "No!" Seria screamed, launching herself forward in desperation. She attacked fiercely, her blade a blur as she pressed the hunter relentlessly, driven by protective fury. "You fight well, Velar," the hunter mocked, deflecting her strikes. "But it's pointless. You can't win this. You underestimate me," Seria hissed defiantly, pushing herself harder. Their blades clashed again and again, echoing sharply through the silent woods. Carl struggled back to his feet, ignoring the pain throbbing through his ribs. He refused to stand idle, as Seria fought desperately. He charged once more, tackling the hunter from behind, knocking him off balance just long enough for Seria to deliver a precise, disabling blow to his side. The hunter fell heavily to the ground, momentarily stunned. Seria stepped forward quickly, her blade pressed firmly against his throat. "It's over," she breathed heavily, eyes fierce and determined. The hunter laughed bitterly, his gaze defiant. "You think this ends with me? Others will come. You can't run forever, Velar." Seria's jaw tightened, eyes flashing dangerously. "Tell them all then. Tell them I'm done running." She pressed the blade harder against his skin, but Carl gently touched her shoulder, urging calm. "We don't have to do this," he whispered gently. Seria hesitated, her grip loosening slightly. Carl's presence was grounding, calming her anger just enough for clarity. "Go," she finally said coldly, stepping back and lowering her weapon slightly. "Warn them. Next time, I won't be merciful." The hunter stared at her, disbelief mixed with grudging respect. Slowly he rose, backing away into the woods. Seria watched until he vanished completely, her breathing heavy. Carl stepped beside her quietly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll face whatever comes together," he promised softly. She looked up at him, resolve strengthening in her eyes. Together, Seria took a deep breath, steadying herself as Carl's comforting presence lingered beside her. They had survived this encounter, but she knew it was far from over. The hunter's words echoed ominously in her mind, each syllable a grim reminder that their peace was temporary. "We need to move," Seria said urgently, turning to Carl with determination etched across her features. "They'll return soon, and with greater numbers." Carl nodded solemnly, his expression resolute despite the obvious pain he still endured. "Where do we go from here?" She hesitated briefly, weighing their limited options. Finally, her eyes hardened, decision made. "There's an old outpost deeper in the mountains. It's abandoned but defensible. It might buy us enough time to figure out our next move." Carl smiled faintly, his trust in her clear and unwavering. "Then lead the way." Together they set out through the deep snow, their pace quick, yet cautious. Every rustling branch and distant sound heightened their alertness, both fully aware of the hunters that pursued them relentlessly. Seria moved swiftly, guiding Carl along a narrow path. Only she knew, every step calculated to minimize their tracks and evade detection. As they traveled, Carl's breathing grew heavier, his injuries clearly taking their toll. Seria slowed her pace slightly, casting worried glances over her shoulder. "We can rest soon," she reassured him gently, her voice softer than usual. Carl forced a reassuring smile. "I'm fine. Keep going." She paused, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You don't have to pretend with me, Carl. I know you're hurting." He sighed softly, nodding in acknowledgement. "I just don't want to slow us down." Seria's gaze softened, gratitude and concern mingling in her eyes. "We're in this together, remember?" Carl met her gaze warmly, sincerity radiating from him. "I remember." Encouraged by their shared determination, they pressed onward. After nearly an hour of trekking through the difficult terrain, Seria finally spotted their destination ahead. Nestled against the mountainside, the abandoned outpost appeared stark and cold, yet welcoming in its isolation. "There," she said, pointing ahead. "That's it." Relief visibly washed over Carl's features. "Looks like it'll do the trick." They approached carefully, Seria taking point, and scanning for any sign of danger. Once satisfied it was safe, she pushed open the heavy metal door, the creaking hinges echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the air was stale, cold and filled with the ghosts of the past. Seria quickly set about securing the perimeter, while Carl collapsed onto an old dusty bench, breathing heavily. "We'll be safe here, for now," she murmured, moving swiftly to secure windows and doors. "At least long enough to catch our breath." Carl watched her quietly, admiration clear in his tired eyes. "You never stop fighting, do you?" Seria paused, glancing over at him, determination blazing fiercely within her gaze. "Not until it's safe. Not until we're both free." He nodded slowly, understanding and resolve strengthening his expression. "Then let's keep fighting." Seria smiled faintly, feeling courage surge within her. "Together," she whispered again, their bond now unbreakable. The abandoned outpost was silent, except for the occasional creak of old metal, and the distant whistle of wind seeping through cracks in the walls. Seria quickly finished, securing the windows and doors, ensuring they were as protected as possible. Carl watched her quietly, admiration evident in his tired eyes. Despite his injuries and exhaustion, he felt a newfound sense of determination, inspired by Seria's unwavering strength and resilience. "What's next?" he asked gently, breaking the heavy silence. Seria turned to face him, her gaze steady and focused. "We need a plan. They'll track us here eventually, and when they come, they'll be better prepared." Carl nodded, seriousness replacing the gentle humor in his expression. "Do we have a plan, or are we improvising as we go?" "A bit of both," Seria admitted, a slight smile touching her lips briefly. "We'll need to set traps around the perimeter, slow them down, give ourselves a chance to fight back." Carl pushed himself up, wincing slightly as pain shot through his ribs. Ignoring Seria's concerned look, he moved toward her, steadying himself with determination. "I'm ready, just tell me what needs doing." Seria studied him carefully, admiration growing in her gaze. "All right, we'll set traps first, then reinforce our defenses here." Together they moved quickly, gathering materials from the abandoned supply closets, and setting careful traps around the outpost. They worked efficiently, their movements coordinated, each aware of the other's actions without needing words. The trust they'd built between them made everything smoother, each step reinforcing their bond. Hours passed, and soon the perimeter was fortified, the outpost prepared for an inevitable confrontation. Seria stood quietly beside Carl, eyes scanning their work critically, ensuring no detail was overlooked. Carl leaned against a sturdy pillar, breathing heavily from the effort but smiling with satisfaction. "Think it'll hold? Long enough to give us a fighting chance," Seria said firmly, confidence clear in her voice. "We can hold them off here, maybe even turn the tables." Carl nodded slowly, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Why do you think they want you so badly?" "It seems personal." Seria hesitated, clearly conflicted. Finally she met his eyes, vulnerability briefly surfacing, before determination masked it again. "I was their best warrior," she said quietly, almost reluctantly. "I know their tactics, their methods. They won't rest until I'm captured or eliminated." Carl's gaze softened, sympathy and understanding clear on his face. "Then we won't let that happen." Seria smiled faintly, the warmth in her chest spreading despite her best efforts to remain guarded. "Thank you." Carl stepped closer, voice firm and reassuring. "We fight together. Whatever happens, I've got your back." She looked deeply into his eyes, feeling trust build solidly between them, undeniable and comforting. and I've got yours. A quiet, powerful moment passed between them, sealing their partnership and strengthening their resolve. No matter what came next, they were ready to face it together, bound by trust, courage, and a shared determination to survive. As night fell, shadows stretched across the abandoned outpost, cloaking everything in a deep, foreboding darkness. Seria and Carl remained vigilant, their senses heightened, awaiting the inevitable attack. Silence settled over them, oppressive and thick with tension. A distant sound, a crunch of snow underfoot, shattered the uneasy quiet. Seria immediately stood alert, her eyes sharp, muscles taut. Carl quickly positioned himself beside her, heart racing with adrenaline and anticipation. His injuries now seemed distant, replaced by fierce determination and resolve. They exchanged a brief, meaningful glance, each drawing strength from the other. "Ready?" Seria asked softly. Carl nodded decisively, his voice firm. "Ready?" The attackers moved silently, emerging from the shadows one by one. There were more this time, each warrior heavily armed and clearly determined. Seria immediately recognized their leader, a tall figure, his face scarred, eyes cold and merciless. "Veller," the leader called harshly, his voice cutting through the night. "You had your chance to surrender. Now there will be no mercy." Seria stepped forward defiantly, her eyes blazing with fierce determination. "I never asked for mercy." With a nod from their leader, the warriors surged forward, triggering the traps Carl and Seria had meticulously set. Explosions echoed sharply through the night, flashes of light illuminating the chaos as several attackers were thrown back, stunned and injured. But still they came, relentless and fierce. Carl fought bravely beside Seria, wielding a makeshift weapon with determination and skill. Seria's blade danced fluidly, her movements swift and deadly, striking with precision. The outpost echoed with the sounds of battle, steel clashing, cries of pain, and the roar of determination. Through it all, Carl and Seria remained side by side, each protecting the other, their bond giving them strength. Slowly, the tide turned in their favor. The attackers faltered, losing ground as their numbers dwindled. Seria pressed her advantage, eyes locked onto the scarred leader. He charged at her, their blades colliding in a fierce, decisive clash. The force nearly knocked Seria off balance, but she recovered quickly, countering with determined strikes of her own. "You can't win, Veller," he hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your rebellion ends here." Seria glared defiantly, meeting each blow with fierce resolve. "My rebellion is just beginning." With a final powerful thrust, she disarmed him, knocking his weapon from his grip. Her blade pressed firmly against his chest, her eyes blazing with triumph and determination. "Tell your masters that I'm finished hiding," Seria growled. "If they pursue me again, they'll regret it." Defeated and furious, the leader staggered backward, signaling his remaining warriors to retreat. Soon, silence returned to the outpost, the battle finally over. Carl stepped beside Seria, breathing heavily, but smiling proudly. "You were incredible." Seria turned to him, gratitude and affection softening her expression. "We both were." Together they stood in the aftermath of their victory, stronger than ever, ready to face whatever the future held, united, fearless, and finally free. The first light of dawn began to break through the lingering darkness, casting gentle rays across the snow-covered landscape surrounding the outpost. The silence felt profound now, comforting rather than oppressive. Seria and Carl sat quietly beside each other, near a small fire they'd built, warmth and a sense of safety finally settling over them after the intense battle. Carl broke the silence first, his voice calm yet thoughtful. "I didn't think we'd actually make it out alive." Seria glanced over at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You doubted us?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head slightly. "Not for a second, but I've never faced anything quite like this before." Her expression softened further as she regarded him warmly. "You handled it well, Carl, better than most warriors I've known." Carl smiled gently, clearly appreciating her praise. "High compliment coming from you." They fell silent again, content to simply sit together, letting the quiet wrap around them comfortably. After a while Carl spoke again, his tone slightly more serious. "What happens now? We can't stay here forever." Seria nodded slowly, clearly having thought about this already. "No, we can't. They'll regroup eventually. But we bought ourselves some time, enough to figure out our next steps." Carl leaned closer, his eyes earnest and sincere. "Wherever you go, I'll follow. You won't face this alone anymore." Seria looked deeply into his eyes, gratitude clear in her expression. I know, and I trust you, Carl, more than I ever thought possible. He reached out cautiously, gently taking her hand in his own. We'll find a place together, somewhere they won't think to look for us. She squeezed his hand gently, warmth spreading through her chest. I'd like that. For a long moment, they simply sat together in peaceful silence, the future stretching out before them filled with uncertainty, yet for the first time, hope as well. The thought of facing it together made the unknown far less intimidating. Eventually, Seria rose to her feet, brushing the snow from her clothes. We should gather supplies. We'll leave soon while we still have the advantage. Carl nodded firmly, standing beside her. Lead the way. As they moved around the outpost, quickly collecting whatever useful supplies they could find, their movements were efficient, a testament to the deep trust they had built. Each step they took, each item they gathered, felt like another small victory, another step toward their newfound freedom. Soon they stood ready at the entrance, packs secured and spirits high despite the lingering exhaustion from the fight. Seria glanced at Carl, her eyes bright with determination and hope. Ready for whatever comes next? She asked softly. Carl smiled warmly, confidence radiating from him. As long as you're with me, absolutely. With one last glance at the outpost that had sheltered them through the darkest moments, they stepped forward together, embarking on a journey neither had anticipated, bound by trust, friendship, and an unbreakable bond forged in adversity. Seria and Carl journeyed steadily through the snow-covered wilderness, each step taking them further from danger and closer to an uncertain yet hopeful future. The crisp air felt invigorating, clearing their minds and sharpening their senses. Neither spoke much, content to walk in comfortable silence, each lost in their thoughts about what lay ahead. After several hours, the rugged terrain began to soften, giving way to gentle hills and sparse forests. They paused briefly to rest, taking shelter beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient tree. Carl eased himself down carefully, wincing slightly from lingering soreness. You okay? Seria asked gently, noticing his discomfort. Carl gave a reassuring smile, rubbing his ribs lightly. Just feeling the aftermath. I'll be fine. Seria knelt beside him, concern evident in her eyes as she examined him closely. Let me check it. Carl hesitated, but complied, allowing her to lift his shirt slightly, revealing a dark, angry bruise spreading across his side. Siria's brow furrowed in concern, her fingers gently tracing the injury, causing him to inhale sharply. It's worse than you said, she murmured, reaching into her pack for the medical supplies they'd gathered earlier. You shouldn't push yourself too hard. Carl chuckled softly, despite the pain, his eyes warm as they met hers. Easier said than done when we're constantly fighting for survival. She smiled softly in return, carefully applying a soothing ointment to his bruised skin. True, but remember we're in this together now. You don't have to pretend with me. Carl reached out gently, placing his hand lightly on hers. I know, and I trust you completely. Seria felt her heart flutter slightly, warmth rising in her chest. She quickly finished tending to his injury, then sat back beside him, leaning comfortably against the sturdy trunk. What do you think our new home will look like? Carl asked thoughtfully, breaking the silence after a moment. Seria smiled faintly, eyes drifting to the distant horizon. Somewhere quiet, peaceful, hidden enough that we don't have to constantly watch our backs. Carl nodded, imagining the scene she described. Maybe near a lake, surrounded by trees, a place we could finally call home. Seria turned to him, eyes bright with hope. I'd like that very much. He squeezed her hand gently, warmth and reassurance radiating from him. Then we'll find it. A comfortable silence settled around them again, each savoring the quiet moment of peace. After a while, Seria rose, stretching slightly, and offering her hand to Carl. Ready to keep moving? She asked softly. Carl accepted her hand gratefully, rising slowly to his feet, determination clear on his face. Together they continued their journey, each step reinforcing their bond and strengthening their resolve. The uncertainty ahead no longer felt daunting. Instead, it was an opportunity for a fresh start, a chance to build a life free from the shadows of their pasts. As they walked side by side, hope grew brighter, lighting their path forward. As the day progressed, the landscape around Seria and Carl gradually transformed, giving way to lush forests and gently flowing streams. The harsh, icy wilderness now seemed distant, replaced by vibrant signs of life and renewal. Birds chirped softly from the trees, and the sound of running water provided a peaceful backdrop to their journey. After hours of steady travel, they reached the edge of a serene lake, nestled in a sheltered valley, surrounded by towering pines and lush greenery. The sight was breathtaking, a perfect reflection of the tranquil refuge they'd imagined. Carl paused, taking in the beauty before them, with a deep sense of peace. "It's exactly how we pictured it." Seria nodded slowly, eyes bright with quiet joy. "Better even. This feels right." They walked closer to the lakeshore, the soft grass beneath their feet, offering comfort and relief after their arduous trek. Carl knelt by the water's edge, dipping his hands into the cool, refreshing lake. Seria watched him quietly, a warm smile spreading across her face. "This could be home," she said softly, voice full of hopeful possibility. Carl stood, turning to face her with sincere determination. "Then let's make it ours." Together, they began exploring the area, quickly finding an ideal spot to build a small shelter. Working side by side, their cooperation seamless and natural, they gathered materials and started constructing their new home. Every log placed and every stone set strengthened, not just their shelter, but the bond they'd built through hardship and trust. As the sun began to set, casting golden hues across the lake's calm surface, they finished their humble yet sturdy cabin. Exhausted but satisfied, they stood back, admiring their handiwork. "It's perfect," Carl said softly, his voice filled with pride and gratitude. Seria nodded, leaning gently against his side. "It truly is. We built it together." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, both comforted and inspired by their mutual support. "Together, we can face anything that comes our way." Seria looked up into his eyes, sincerity and trust shining clearly. "I believe that now." Nightfall enveloped the valley, stars appearing one by one in the clear, vast sky. They built a small fire outside their new home, sitting together and gazing up into the endless expanse above, quietly reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. "You know," Carl said thoughtfully, breaking the peaceful silence, "for the first time in a very long while, I feel genuinely hopeful." Seria squeezed his hand gently, smiling warmly. "Me too, and it's because of you." He leaned closer, their faces softly illuminated by the firelight. "And you've given me a reason to keep believing in something better." Seria's eyes softened, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's promise each other this. We'll protect this hope, no matter what." Carl nodded solemnly, sincerity deepening his voice. "Always." As they sat beneath the starlit sky, the warmth of their new home and the strength of their bond filled them both with a profound sense of belonging. Together, Seria and Carl knew they had finally found the place they had always sought, a sanctuary built on trust, hope, and love.